Good morning. It's time to begin. So today for Adult Forum, we're very honored to have two of our own delightful and cherished people in our congregation, Gary Olson and Ruth Hagender. They both are poets and have sometimes shared their poetry in the past. Well, they're poets in heart and actually have written poetry or shared poetry before that has really made me think a lot, and I'm sure that made you think a lot and touched our spirits. So that's what we're after today, and how poetry can really affect your life. And we think of singing and hymns and words there too. That's also poetry to music and same thing. But anyway, we're going to hear from them today. And so I don't know who goes first, but I'll let you guys take over.
Thank you. It's a real joy to be here. And it's a real joy to work with Ruth on this. We've met, what, 3 times and laughed and hashed things over and wondered what we're going to do. But we know now. I'm going to start with a poem, but I want to introduce it. Because many years ago, I say many years ago, I can't remember when it was exactly. I was asked to give a talk at the St. Paul Area Synod Assembly. And my subject was financial stewardship. Isn't that a great one? And the Synod was in need of more money and more giving better giving from congregations. And so I was the chair of one of the committees in the Synod, and they asked me to do this talk. And I thought, how in the world am I going to talk? You know, as soon as you mention money in the church, the eyes glaze over. And everybody you're talking with, right? And I thought that I have to get their attention. So I decided to read a poem to begin. And I'm going to read the same poem now. It's by Shel Silverstein. Some of you know who that is. And it's called Smart. My dad gave me $1 bill because I'm his smartest son. And I swapped it for 2 shiny quarters because 2 is more than 1. And then I took the quarters and traded them to Lou for 3 dimes. I guess he don't know that 3 is more than 2. Just then along came old blind Bates. And just because he can't see, he gave me 4 nickels for my 3 dimes. And 4 is more than 3. And I took the nickels to Hiram Coombs down at the seed feed store. And the fool gave me 5 pennies for my 4 nickels, and 5 is more than 4. And then I went and showed my dad, and he got red in the cheeks and closed his eyes and shook his head, too proud of me to speak. Yeah, I like that one. One of the reasons I think I use that poem is because it has humor. And I think poetry gets a bad rap as being heavy and very serious, and people stay away from it because of that. Difficult to understand, too esoteric. And then you run into someone like Shel Silverstein, and you know that's not true at all, at least for his writing. And so when I was trying to pick this poem for that Synod Assembly, I thought back to when I had homiletics class, which is preaching at the seminary, Luther Seminary. And my main teacher of preaching was Arndt Halverson. Some of you will know the name. He was just a terrific preacher himself and a good teacher of preaching. And he said to us one day in class, he said, you know, most pastors are tragedians. They see the serious side of life and they talk about the serious side of life a lot. But he said most parishioners are comedians. And many of them see the humor in things, the irony, the humorous things of life. He said, remember that when you're preparing your sermons or when you're teaching something in the parish, to use a little humor to kind of open their minds and their hearts and their spirits so you can drop something good in there. And then he said, if you want to improve your preaching and you want to use words in a more creative way and you want people to see an image, a picture of something, a metaphor, he said, start reading the poets. Don't have to quote them, but just start reading the poets for your own sake. And you'll see how they do it. And make use of it in your ministry. I thought it was just a wonderful, I've remembered those two things from my seminary education all these years. So my question today is to all of us. Well, I was going to quote Mary Oliver, who's a poet. You know, some of you may know who she is. She just died a year ago, maybe, something like that. He said, maybe the desire to make something beautiful is a piece of God that is inside each of us. The desire to make something beautiful. For me, that's what poetry does. So I'm going to ask you today, how many of you choose to read poetry? More than I expected, actually. And what if you read poetry, if you care to comment, I hope you will, we want to engage in some conversation here. What draws you to poetry? Humor? Okay. Tragedy and humor. There you go. Yes. The dark and the light together. Yeah. Okay.
A new viewpoint.
It's just
Oh,
a
sorry.
different way of hearing words connect.
Okay. Yeah.
I like rhythm.
Yeah, poets put them together in different ways, sometimes in different ways that are kind of tickles our ears, or mine anyway. Somebody else was saying.
I was viewing the world or life in a different way through a different lens.
Okay. Very nice. Very good. And anybody want to talk about what keeps you from reading poetry? What keeps you from reading poetry?
Some of it's so difficult to understand.
Difficult to understand? Yeah. Trish?
Being lazy.
Being lazy? Susan?
I don't think anybody really taught me how to read poetry.
Okay.
Can you repeat the statement?
Yeah, Susan says she doesn't think anyone ever taught her how to read poetry. It's probably true in schools. Yeah. Ruth and I were talking about when we were in school, I think I was in high school when this happened, that we were required to memorize a poem and read it to the class. I can't remember what I read. I don't remember anymore. But we were required to do that. And Ruth said she was too at that point. I'm just going to read something from a poet called, his name is Galloway Connell from Rhode Island. He says, to me, poetry is somebody standing up, so to speak, and saying with as little concealment as possible what it is for him or her to be on earth at this moment. Something far different than I ever thought about poetry, just to see it that kind of way. So I just wanted to read that. And now Ruth and I have to say also that Ruth and I, although we're leading this, we're like you. We are not authorities on poetry. I think I know that both of us feel and think that same way. We're not authorities. We're not academics. We can, do a lot of things with poetry in terms of appreciating poetry, by reading it, appreciating poetry, by writing it as well as we're able. But we're hoping that you will end up in this session having some kind of appreciation for poetry and what it can do in your life. Speak to something inside you to make you smile, to help you through a troubled time, to strengthen your faith, or just find joy in the beauty of the language, as was said back here. But anyway, we're going to each try to earn our keep here by each reading one of our own poems. Yes.
I was just gonna throw something out, and I'm kind of a Jackie Kennedy fan. And for what she did for her, with her children, is instead of giving them material gifts, they would memorize a poem. And that was her birthday gift. And then Caroline Kennedy has a little, I don't know if any of you know
Wow.
the book of poems that they learned as they were growing up. And her brother's poems and her poems, and of course, they were so different.
Wow, that's
He-
great.
He loved the humorous ones.
Yeah,
And,
Yeah,
so. I thought that
that's
was
wonderful. I know the Kennedys and John F. Kennedy and the Kennedy family love poetry and creative writing and things like that. This is an aside now, but I read not long ago that when JFK was being inaugurated as president, he asked Robert Frost to write and read a poem at his inauguration ceremony, which Frost did. And he was in his late 80s at the time he got up to read this. And when he got up there, the person who I was reading said the lighting was so bad and his eyesight wasn't good enough, and the print on the page was so light, he couldn't read it. So instead, he quoted about a 3 or 4 page poem that he had written from memory. Boy, oh boy. Okay, anyway, I'm going to ask if Ruth will read her poem.
When somebody mentioned about poetry being too difficult to understand, I read someplace that you can't read poetry like a newspaper or a novel. And sometimes you have to, read it and then maybe reread it, read it out loud, and maybe ponder it more than you do just reading a novel. Anyway, this poem today is The Golden Rule. Today's scripture, the Golden Rule, I learned as a child in Sunday school. Do unto others means all sisters and brothers. What does that mean for me today with all my actions and display? Have I been zealous about holding hands with other faiths, other brands? Do I do what I could do? Share a smile when someone's blue? Do unto others. Have I ostracized someone not like me? Was there a bias I refuse to see? When I feast, do I share food with hungry folks? Help change a mood? Do I pray there'll be a home for some lone person seen to roam? Do unto others. A false prophet takes the stage. Can I somehow show my rage? With trepidation, I step back. It's courage that I lack. I'm tired of rhetoric that goes nowhere. A plan of action. Do I dare? Do unto others. On and on, a lengthy list. The golden rule, a challenge missed. Untenable is my lack of care when I have multiple gifts to share. A little forgiveness is not enough. To relinquish a grudge can really be tough. Do unto others. Hate runs rampant everywhere, but With bravado, there's love to spare. Love's the antidote for hates that soar. Join hands, pray, we can do more. That that bit of love costs not a cent. As I ponder where kindness went, do unto others. I pray that God will hold my hand. With that support, I then can stand. I live but once, now's my chance. Together, we can sing and dance. The world needs love. Forgiveness too. Look around. See the view? Do unto others.
That's wonderful. Ruth does a wonderful job of rhyming. And she puts herself down for it, like rhyming isn't important. Rhyming is a very important part of poetry, and I'm not good at it. But you are. And so really appreciate it. That really fit with the sermon for today.
Yeah.
Pastor Peters, you haven't heard it yet.
Perfect.
Yeah, went very well. I'm gonna read a poem from my book, and by the way, I have 20 copies here, and I'm gonna put in the back. I mean, 20 copies of the book, not of. I'm gonna put them in the back on a table, so if any of you want one, you can take it. No charge or anything, just take it. And someone told me I'm gonna get in trouble for that because I sold them a couple, 2 or 3 years ago here. And the people who bought it will now say I should have waited. I could have had nothing. But anyway, I'll do that at the end. So I'm reading a poem that is about a man who was in my first parish in South Dakota. And you will get a feel for who he was as I read. And it is connected with doing unto others as you would have them do to you, but it's more indirect. It's called Neil, the man's name, Neal, Neil. Every day he rose early in the dark and went to work as lineman on the Milwaukee Road. Warm or cold, snow or sun, ill or well, he rose and went. Never missed a day of work. Saturdays, we only knew what we saw. Mowing grass, doing repairs, shoveling snow at his parents' home, his home too. Sent uptown for groceries, he walked and carried. Sunday mornings early, he ushered at the church. Permanent usher, some called him. He never missed. He'd shake hands, stammer greetings, hand out programs. You'd think this was his home, the way he works. All agreed that he was slow of mind. Something went wrong at birth, perhaps, we did not know. Most avoided him, left him alone, even his neighbor. Never complaining, he simply did what needed doing. Slow of mind for certain, but not slow of heart. Much of what he did was done for parents and for neighbors. Slow of mind for sure, but quick to care and serve. Early every day, he rose to do what's needed. You'd think this was his home, the way he works. Doing was the way he tried to let us know his heart, because words for him just would not flow. Once, impulsively, he hugged my wife and me. You'd think we were his family.
Oh, that's beautiful.
We're up, right? Yep. Take it away, Ruth.
Sort of have an order. We talked about, what is poetry? Hymns are poetry. For sure. Prayers are poetry. The Bible is full of examples of poetry. You think of course, the Psalms. You think of the Beatitudes in the New Testament. Songs of Solomon. Let's see. The Ecclesiastes, time to live, a time to die. There's so many examples. There's a fellow, he's an Oxford scholar, lives in England, who has a project he calls poetry therapy. And it's a project that he takes to libraries and festivals and schools and sometimes hospitals, where we have a book, I think of this. He calls it the poetry remedy. And people line up for his consultations if they have a problem with anxiety or convalescing from an illness or a job problem or whatever. In his book, and he does this in his consultations, suggests specific poems for those situations, which is kind of an interesting approach to dealing with those incidences. One of the things that poetry does sometimes is tell a story. For instance, the poet James Weldon Johnson, Black poet, who also wrote the lyrics for the Black national anthem, Lift Up Your Voice and Sing. He wrote a poem called Creation, based on the first two verses of Genesis, which goes like this. And God stepped out onto space. And he looked around and he said, I'm lonely. I think I'll make me a world. And far as the eye could see, darkness covered everything like 100 midnights deep in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the dark rolled out on one side, light shined out on the other, and God said, that's good. Then God reached out and he took a light in his hands and he rolled it around in his hands to make the sun. And when he made the sun, he set it in the heavens in a shining light. And then with the light that was left from making the sun, he gathered it into a bright crystal ball and flung it into the darkness, and the sky blazed with moon and sun. And then down between the darkness and the light, God hurled the world, and God said, that's good. Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand, the moon was on his left, and the stars clustered above his head, and the earth was under his feet. And God walked, and where he trod, the footsteps carved the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. And God said, that's good. Then he stopped and he looked and he saw that the earth was dry and barren. So he stepped over to the edge of the world and he spat out the seas. He blinked his eyes and the lightning flashed, and he clapped his hands and the thunder roared, and the waters came down from the heavens. The cooling waters came down, and God said, that's good. Then the green grass sprouted, the little red flowers blossomed, the pine tree pointed its fingers up to the sky, the oak spread out his arms, the lakes cuddled down in the hollows of the earth, and the rivers ran down to the seas. And God smiled again. And the rainbow appeared. And the rainbow wrapped its arms around his shoulders. And God said, "That's good."
Ruth reads really well.
Pretty memorable.
Well, you're up again right away. Because we're gonna talk now about reading poetry ourselves, reading it, and perhaps you can find yourself in this conversation as well. How does poetry influence you, Ruth?
Well, I think it depends upon what you're reading and what kind of a mood you're in and so on, but I thought I would just give an example here. Sometimes poetry can inform, sometimes it can challenge. Shortly before the pandemic, my daughter Sonia led a student tour to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem and Palestine. Some of you have been there and have maybe stood on the banks of the Jordan River and maybe even touched the water with your toes. So she wrote a liturgy for a whole service while she was there. And I'm going to just use the part that she wrote about the sacrament of baptism. She says, "We remember the sign of the cross made on our forehead on Ash Wednesday. The same cross marked on foreheads at baptism at the Jordan River, where Jesus was baptized by John." So this is what she says in terms of the sacrament of baptism there by the Jordan River. She says, "Sonia, get your feet in here." Do I dare? Put them in the muddy waters of the Jordan with guns across the Jordan shore? Crap in the river, typhoid in the water. What is holy? White robes dunk with Jesus screen printed across the body, washed in brown sludge. What are you washed in, child of God? You are screen printed too on your body with the Holy Spirit still loose in the world. I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But watch out for guns, the dirty water, fecal material, and other waterborne diseases. The heavens broke open and the Spirit is alive in the world. My God, why have you forsaken us? So that's just, one example, I guess, of how we might be impressed by reading poetry.
The second question is, Gary, how does poetry influence you? Well, it makes me smile. That's one of my reactions to poetry. It also sometimes brings a tear to my eye. And sometimes it makes me more compassionate. Sometimes it makes me wonder what kind of life the poet has been leading that would cause him to write what he or she wrote. And sometimes it just speaks some of it to my heart. And so there's a lot of poetry I don't understand very well. But some of it speaks to my heart and soul. And I'm going to read a poem now from E.E. Cummings. I have to preface this by saying that when I was a boy, I've told this story here before, I know I have. When I was a boy, I used to go to the library, the town library in Cannon Falls where I grew up, which was a library that was an old stone building, you know, with ivy growing up the walls on the outside and that kind of stuff. And it was very small, very tiny place. And I would go in there because it was a kind of quiet place and a place of, I could be alone and think and whatever. And I started pulling books off the shelf and sitting on the floor and reading poetry, most of which I didn't understand, you know, but some of it, I just like the language, like the musicality of it, the way it sounded when I came out of my mouth and those kinds of things. Well, I had a second kind of hobby. My stepfather worked at a farmer's cooperative elevator. He would grind feed. He would grind grain, into feed when the farmers brought it in. And I would love to go on Saturdays. They made feed that was not filled with, but mixed with molasses. Oh, I loved the smell of molasses, you know, and I'd go over there. I'd ask him when they were going to do the molasses again, and I'd go over there on a Saturday morning or whenever it was. And I would just sit there and smell the molasses. I didn't do any work or anything. I was just sitting on these bags of feed that the farmers are going to come up, pick up. He would mix this and make the feed and out of a farmer's grain, and then the farmer would come and pay him for it and pick it up, that kind of stuff. And so I'd sit there, and often there would be little birds around, you know, sparrows, wrens, whatever kind of, I didn't know all the birds at that point. And they would be peeping and cheeping and singing a little bit, and they'd be picking up, you know, grains of grain and feed or whatever that was on the floor of the elevator, and they would be having a ball eating them. And I discovered that if I sat real still on a bag of feed, the birds would not fly away because they wanted the food. They'd come in even if I was there, and I'd be as quiet as I could be, and they'd start picking away and pecking and singing and all of that kind of stuff. It was a wonderful experience. Well, then a while later, I went to the library, not the same day, but I went to the library, and I was sitting on the floor reading, and I ran across a poem by a man named E.E. Cummings. He's from probably the early 1900s and mid 1900s. Cummings started this way. He said, "May my heart always be open to little birds who are the secrets of living. Whatever they sing is better than to know. And if men should not hear them, men are old. May my mind stroll about hungry and fearless and thirsty and supple. And even if it's Sunday, may I be wrong. For whenever men are right, they are not young. And may myself do nothing usefully and love yourself so more than truly. There's never been quite such a fool who could fail pulling all the sky over him with one smile." It was that first part. May my heart always be open to little birds who are the secrets of living. And of course, he uses the old, you know, he's not gender inclusive here. It's the, you know, he uses the word men instead of people or women. So it's an old kind of style. And when I read that in the library that day, I thought of the elevator where I used to go to just sit and watch the birds and listen to the birds. And it did something to me inside. And I went, wow, the poetry just came alive for me, just seemed more real to me. And I just wanted to read it more and more. So that's one thing poetry does for me still today. It just strikes something in my heart and my mind and my spirit. And it strengthens my faith. I'll get to that in a minute here, but if I'm going on too long, you have to stop me. But yeah, good idea, yeah. And there's a poem that was important to me when I was in high school. I was a senior in high school and I was getting ready to decide what I was gonna do with my life, I thought. And I read a poem by Robert Frost. I did not know what I wanted to do. I thought, well, I'll graduate and I'll get a job, maybe at the Hastings Cement Factory making cement blocks, you know, and I'll just be happy. And my teachers thought I should go to college. And I knew as a family, we could not afford that, so. But then I ran across this poem, The Road Not Taken, you know it, probably Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though, as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere, ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So, it's a good one. So poetry kind of educated me that way, how to look at life and not be so afraid of taking risks. So I went to college, you know, and thought, oh, I'll pay for it later. You know what you think when you're a kid or something like a teenager. And I didn't have to pay for it later. My father, who was estranged from us, lived on the West Coast, and he paid my tuition. Thankfully, he paid my tuition. He wanted me to be a businessman and be rich.
Show him.
I have to tell you this story because when I went to seminary, I thought, I called my dad and I told him what I was going to do. And he said to me, I thought you were going to get a white collar job. And I said, that's what I'm going to do. It's a white collar. And he was angry. He was angry with me for a while. And then he got over it. Funny what your parents think you ought to do, you know, that kind of stuff. Well, anyway, two roads diverged in the woods, and I took the one less traveled by. Yeah, it's made a big difference in my life. And so all of this made me, through poetry, made me wonder about life and think about life in many different ways. And part of it for me was that it strengthened my faith. It strengthens my faith still today. I don't know. I don't know. Can I read two poems? You mind?
Sure.
There's a poem in here. I think I can find it in a hurry. You know, I used to have interns when I had been, you know, about 15 years of contextual ed students and interns and that kind of stuff. And I think I can find this here. I hope. Yes. And one of my interns said to me one day in one of her meetings that she said, you attract the strangest people. I don't know who she expected would come to the church. You attract the strangest people. I got to thinking about that. And then several years later, I wrote a poem about it. But it's not me, it's Jesus. It's called Attraction. He attracted the strangest people. Ragged herdsmen, foreign astrologers, of course we think, who wouldn't be drawn to a babe. But later, homeless beggars and wealthy businessmen, the lame and blind, a priest or two, a woman of the streets, a politician who came at night, the mentally ill, a potential anarchist, a teacher, the divorced, gay, straight, pretenders tired of pretending, children who received so well. He attracted the strangest disparate people. Love must be the reason. Love his center. Love unlike another. Love that burns away pretense, yet warms you to life. That lasts and lasts and lasts and lasts. He attracts the strangest people. Perhaps I'll see you there.
Can I interject here that I was going to, that's one of my favorite poems out of his book. And I was going to read this poem from a contemporary, well-known poet. And not name any names, see if you recognize it.
I'm sorry, I stole your thunder.
So you've got to tell a personal story.
Yeah.
So, I think my life of poetry probably began about third grade. No, long before that, and pay tribute to what Carol said about children and poetry. Because I think we all learned nursery rhymes when we were children and memorized them and repeated them over and over and over again. And maybe that's where the rhyming comes from. You know, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses, all the king's men could put Humpty together again. The one thing we didn't know was that it wasn't what it appeared. According to historians, Humpty Dumpty was really a weapon, a cannon that was used during the Civil War in England back in the 1600s. They would set these cannons up on a stone wall, and when the enemies shot at the wall crumbled, the cannons fell off, broke, and they could never be used again. But of course, as kids, we didn't know anything about that. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow with silver bells and cockleshell all in a row? Mary, according to historians, was Mary Tudor, a very wicked queen who executed Christians. And her garden was the bodies of those people that she executed. And silver bells and cockleshell were instruments of torture. Anyway, back to third grade.
Better all start.
Our teacher, I can even remember her name, Ethel Lolan, assigned us to write a poem. I'm sure she didn't talk about haiku or sonnets or, strain of consciousness thought, any of that. But I was excited about doing that. I know that she read poetry to us probably every day, maybe started the day that way. Well, I was excited about doing that, going home with my assignment because my dad was a poet and perfect setting. So, and he was very busy, of course, but we talked a little bit and he scratched off this poem. The next day we brought our assignments to school and our teacher read each one of our poems out loud to the class. And when she got to mine and read it, she said, "Oh, that's lovely. Your dad gets an A." Not only had I not written it, I hadn't even recopied it in my own hand.
Oh, that's why she's fun to work with. Oh, what time do we need to end here?
You got 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. I'm not gonna do what I was going to do. I'm gonna hand out that poem about the rowing ended,
Yeah.
but I'm not gonna read it.
Oh, you're not.
Or do you want me to read it?
I
I
think you
don't-
should.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, read it.
She's the boss. Okay, I'll just hand this out. You can just pass it along if you would. This poem, I'll introduce it by saying this poem was written by Anne Sexton, who died in 1974. She was from Connecticut, a very good poet, but she didn't know she was a poet until after her second child was born and she went into postpartum depression. And she was in therapy the rest of her life. Terribly depressed at times, had to be hospitalized, those kinds of. A therapist asked her to start writing between sessions.
I have.
And she started writing and and she wrote a book entitled The Awful Going Toward God. I don't have the book at home, but I have this poem that I think it ends the book, and it's towards the end of the book. And when you have it in your hand, you don't have to look at it while I'm reading. I mean, don't read along with me, just listen, and then you can read it later if you'd like. But think of something that sticks out for you in this poem. The rowing endeth, Anne Sexton. I'm mooring my rowboat at the dock of the island called God. This dock is made in the shape of a fish, and there are many boats moored at many different docks. It's okay, I say to myself, with blisters that broke and healed, saving themselves over and over. And salt sticking to my face and arms like a glue skin pocked with grains of tapioca. I empty myself from my wooden boat and onto the flesh of the island. On with it, he says. And thus we squat on the rocks by the sea and play, can it be true? A game of poker. He calls me. I win because I hold a royal straight flush. He wins because he holds 5 aces. A wild card had been announced, but I had not heard it, being in such a state of awe when he took out the cards and dealt. As he plunks down his 5 aces and I sit grinning at my royal flush, he starts to laugh. The laughter rolling like a hoop out of his mouth and into mine, and such laughter that he doubles right over me, laughing a rejoiced chorus at our 2 triumphs. Then I laugh. The fishy dock laughs, the sea laughs, the island laughs, the absurd laughs. Dearest dealer, I with my royal straight flush love you so for your wild card, that untamable, eternal, gut-driven ha-ha and lucky love. Hard to listen to maybe, but it's a wonderful poem. It wasn't long after, several months after this, I hate to bring that up, but Anne Sexton committed suicide. She took her own life. Her depression was so deep, she just couldn't come out of it. Anyway, anything stand out in that poem to you?
Oh, too many aces. She had a royal flush. That's 1 ace. There wouldn't be 5 aces left for.
I don't know.
I think it said a straight flush.
Yeah, it said, what did it say here?
Great.
Well, it's straight flush.
Straight flush, so that's another.
I don't know anything about poker so much. It's a wild card. Yeah. The laughter stuff. Okay. The what?
Wasn't there a mention of blisters?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what caused.
Okay. Yeah. The blisters and everything, the sufferings of life that she went through, and many people go through. Yeah. Anyway, I when I first read that poem, I was just so taken by it. I thought to myself, I want that read at my funeral. You know, and it wasn't too long after that we started coming to Prince of Peace, and most of you would know who I'm talking about. Pastor Andrew Robbins was preaching. He used that poem. And I knew at that point that he had cancer. And he used that poem in his sermon. I just sat there dumbfounded. You know, so anyway, yeah, it's a really a good one. I'll move on, right? How many of you write poetry? Scott? Others? Two of you, others? Oh, Karen, yeah, very good. Yeah. What pulls you to write? What makes you want to write?
Developmental discovery,
Discovery, just the whole
developmental discovery.
developmental discovery. Okay. I don't know quite what that means, but
Well, it's. Discovery of how you were shaped by childhood events.
okay, yeah,
And how those events flowed into the meaning of your life.
yeah.
And how you became what you were.
Wonderful. He's saying it's how you were shaped as a child and how those events that shaped you help you move on in life, or what you do with them in life, that kind
Well,
of.
how they give you challenges
Okay,
and they present challenges that you have to overcome.
challenges in life. So developmental discovery of yourself. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah.
I've been known to journal from time to time.
Yeah.
Is that also a type of poetry? Yeah.
Well, I think it is. I think I journal too. And I think it is a kind of poetry. That's what got me started writing. That was journaling, and then I thought I should do something with this stuff and start writing something. I didn't know what. So. Yeah, journaling can be a type of poetry, that's for sure. I know Jean told me one year, we used to have a bishop here, Elmo Augustson. I don't know if you remember the name at all, but he would send a Christmas greeting to all the pastors and everybody every year, and it was like in the form of a poem. And Jean one day said to me, well, you could do that. Instead of sending a Christmas card, let's send one of your poems every Christmas. So I've been writing. It just got me going, and I started writing a poem every Christmas for, I don't know, 40 years now, or something like that. The first ones weren't very good at all. Maybe the recent ones aren't either. I hope I've gotten better. But Ruth, what made you start writing?
I guess I just, the whole thing, I loved to read, and as a child, we were read to a lot. And like I said, my dad was a poet, and so he kind of, we used to, he was an immigrant from Norway. And a lot of his poetry is written in Norwegian, and you can't translate it. It doesn't have the same rhythm. It doesn't really have the same meaning. But as children, we used to ask him to, Daddy, say one of your poems, and he'd say it in Norwegian. We couldn't understand it, but it was almost like music. It just sort of rolled off his tongue, and it was, I don't know, I just, it's fun. I guess fun is what I'd have to say.
Could
I
you
think-
say something about? she
But
writes a
letters
Christmas card.
also,
She does-
people write letters. I know a couple of people in this audience who write beautiful letters. That is poetry.
And say something about your Christmas cards, because you do Christmas cards in poetry also, right?
Well, then just kind of like what he was saying, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did you say, Maisie?
I was going to say, didn't you used to tell us about writing poetry to your brother?
Yeah,
And you'd write back and forth. Yeah.
yeah, once my brother and I were, past college and lived across the country from each other, just for fun, we wrote our letters in rhyme. Yeah.
Dan?
Yeah, this is a 90-second quick story. There were 4 of us who were charged by the governor and legislature to restructure higher education in 1980, and it took 20 years to do, so we eliminated general college. We got rid of Zika, we merged the community technical colleges and universities. The strongest fight we had to make and defend was that the general population beyond this room, and I love what you're saying, I'm music and art, is fight to save humanities. Because this, they wanted removed. It doesn't help you find a job. It doesn't, they would go down the list of items and say, why can't we save money and put them over here and do this and do that? Well, that was not permitted. And lo and behold, now it's in the high school area. And those are the first courses to be cut, art, music and things like that. So the family, stay away, you're doing great. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And how much time do we have left?
I just want to make a comment about how I feel like poetry is a sense of connection between humans. And it's a way to get to know yourself better. But even the first 2 lines of her poem, I'm mooring my rowboat at the dock of the island called God, is all about how we are individuals and we have God. So I just think it's all about connection for me.
Yeah, I think you're right. For me too. May I read a closing poem? I don't know if we have time. I was gonna read a poem as a prayer, but I don't know. Should I read that one?
Yeah.
Okay. I listened to Ruth. This is a poem, this is our closing prayer. This is a poem written by John Berryman, who was a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Minnesota for many years. He also committed suicide. Sad to say. He was excellent. Address to the Lord, it's called. Now, you have to understand at the beginning that John Berryman was a member of Judaism. He was of the Jewish faith. Master of beauty, craftsman of the snowflake, inimitable contriver, and dower of earth so gorgeous and different from the boring moon. Thank you for such as it is, my gift. I have made up a morning prayer to you, containing with precision everything that most matters, according to thy will. The thing begins. It took me off and on 2 days. It doesn't aim at eloquence. You have come to my rescue again and again in my impassable, sometimes despairing years. How can I love you? I only as far as gratitude and awe confidently and absolutely go. I have no idea whether we live again. It doesn't seem likely from either the scientific or the philosophical point of view, but certainly all things are possible to you. And I believe as fixedly in the resurrection appearances to Peter and to Paul as I believe I sit in this blue chair. Whatever your end may be, accept my amazement. May I stand until death forever at attention for any your least instruction or enlightenment. I even feel sure you will assist me again, master of insight and beauty. Amen. Thank you for coming.